A nanny floats in on the east wind, turns a nursery into chaos, and somehow convinces an entire London bank to survive a run on its own vault, all before lunch. That's the movie audiences fell in love with in 1964, and on the surface it looks like the gentlest, sunniest thing Walt Disney ever made. A carpetbag, a spoonful of sugar, a chimney sweep who dances on rooftops. But underneath that cheerful surface is one of the messiest, most stubborn, most quietly strange productions in studio history. Julie Andrews plays the title character, a nanny so sure of her own perfection that she keeps a tape measure handy just to confirm it. Dick Van Dyke plays Bert, the chimney sweep with a grin and the accent everyone still argues about. David Tomlinson plays George Banks, a father who manages his household the way a nervous clerk manages a ledger. Glynis Johns plays a suffragette mother more excited about the vote than about her own kids. And Karen Dotrice and Matthew Garber play Jane and Michael, the two children who just want to feed some birds outside a cathedral. Today we're counting down 15 strange, surprising, and occasionally sad facts about how this film actually got made. And stick around for the very end, because the money this movie made is still quietly protecting people's lives on a theme park ride right now, 60 years later. Dick Van Dyke grew up in the American Midwest, nowhere near London, and somehow he ended up cast as a working-class Cockney chimney sweep. The result became one of the most talked-about accents in film history, usually not for good reasons. Entertainment outlets have ranked his Bert voice among the worst screen accents ever committed to film, and Van Dyke himself never really disputed it. He said his dialect coach was Irish and wasn't especially skilled at English accents either, and nobody on set corrected him during filming, so the accent simply stayed as it was. Decades afterward, when asked exactly what region of England he'd been going for, he couldn't pin it down, joking that it seemed to come from some corner of England that was mostly populated by people from Ohio. Here's the twist. Over 50 years later, when the British Film Academy gave him a Lifetime Achievement honor, Van Dyke used part of his speech to apologize, calling it one of the worst Cockney accents ever attempted on screen. Most bad performances just fade away quietly. This one got a standing ovation in 1964 and a formal apology decades later, and somehow both reactions feel earned. Van Dyke wasn't satisfied playing just Bert. After reading the script, he became fascinated by Mr. Dawes Sr., the elderly, wheezing bank chairman who has a memorable death by laughter scene near the end of the film. He wanted the part badly enough to ask for it, and Disney initially said no, since Van Dyke was a young leading man, not an obvious fit for a role requiring heavy old-age makeup. So Van Dyke offered to do it for free. Disney flipped the arrangement instead. If he wanted the role that badly, he'd have to pay for it. Van Dyke agreed, and the money he handed over reportedly went toward the art school Disney had helped establish, meaning his own bribe ended up funding future animators. He spent hours in the makeup chair to become unrecognizable, and it worked. Young Karen Dotrice, who played Jane, apparently had no idea the frightening old banker was played by the same actor who played Bert. In the credits, his second role is billed under an anagram of his real name, which unscrambles into Dick Van Dyke if you look closely enough. George Banks might be the most uptight father in movie history, a man who treats fun like it requires paperwork. It's a nice bit of irony, then, that the actor behind him, David Tomlinson, spent the same production voicing the liveliest character in the whole film, Mary Poppins talking parrot-headed Umbrella. Every time that Umbrella snaps at Mary or grumbles about not being thanked, that's Tomlinson, playing one of the only characters in the movie who dares to needle the impossibly composed nanny to her face. He didn't stop there, either. Tomlinson also lent his voice to a penguin waiter, a jockey, and a race official during the animated Jolly Holiday sequence, and he was joined by several other cast and crew members hiding inside minor animated roles throughout that scene, turning the whole segment into a kind of hidden game for anyone who knows where to look. The most buttoned-up character on Cherry Tree Lane was quietly having more fun behind the microphone than almost anyone else on the production. Mary Poppins won the competitive Academy Award for visual effects, largely thanks to a groundbreaking process that let filmmakers combine live actors with animated backgrounds far more cleanly than traditional blue screen work of the era allowed. The technique used a special camera and a prism to split incoming light, isolating actors from a background so precisely that fine details like hair strands and lace patterns stayed sharp. In the early 1960s, this was essentially the equivalent of modern photocompositing, built entirely from optics and stubborn engineering. There was a catch. There was really only one working camera in Hollywood capable of doing this, and the prism inside it was so difficult to construct that even its own designer struggled to replicate it. That designer, however, wasn't among the names who took home the competitive Oscar. The statuette instead went to the visual artists who applied the technique on screen, while the inventor of the underlying process received a separate, non-competitive technical achievement award. Two different honors for two different contributions to the same piece of movie magic. And a year earlier, the same technology had also been used, unsuccessfully at the Oscars, on a very different film involving swarms of attacking birds. Nothing in Mary Poppins looks harder than it actually was, except maybe two specific scenes. The first is Step in Time, the rooftop sequence where Bert and a crew of chimney sweeps tumble, leap, and tap dance across the chimney pots. The husband and wife choreography team behind the number packed it with acrobatics and rehearsed it relentlessly until all that difficulty looked like pure spontaneous joy. Watching it now, it plays like a group of workers who simply felt like dancing. In reality, it's one of the most tightly drilled sequences in the entire film. The second is far less glamorous, toffee apples. During the animated supercalifragilisticexpialidocious sequence, Jane and Michael were supposed to look like they were happily eating toffee apples, take after take after take, until the child actors were thoroughly sick of the taste. It didn't help that Dick Van Dyke, apparently something of a prankster between setups, convinced the prop team to swap in a batch made with a genuinely unpleasant flavor purely to catch the kids' reaction on camera. None of that struggle shows up on screen. Just a rooftop full of dancers making acrobatics look casual, and two children gamely chewing through what amounted to sabotage candy. Jane Darwell had already won an Academy Award decades earlier for a supporting role in a Depression-era drama, and by the time Mary Poppins was casting, she was in her mid-80s, retired, and living at a home for aging performers. Disney wanted her for a brief, nearly wordless role, the Bird Woman, sitting quietly on the cathedral steps during the film's most melancholy song, Feed the Birds. She said no. She'd retired and wasn't interested in coming back for one small scene. So Disney didn't settle for a phone call. He drove out and asked her in person, and she agreed. It turned out to be the final role of her career. She passed away a few years later. That song mattered enormously to Disney personally. By many accounts, it was his favorite piece of music in the entire film, and he reportedly asked to hear it played back to him on quiet afternoons. The smallest, quietest performance in the movie belonged to a woman Disney wanted badly enough to show up at her door himself. In the late 1980s, Disney tried to get a Mary Poppins sequel moving, and author P.L. Travers, who had famously battled the studio the first time around, agreed to cooperate again, but only with a collaborator she personally trusted. That collaborator worked with her to build a treatment based on her later Poppins books, and pitched it to Disney leadership to get it produced. The studio, however, didn't want Bert back and asked for a new character to fill his role as the children's guide. Travers and her collaborator pulled a character from the books, an ice cream vendor who helps the kids retrieve a runaway kite, only to discover Mary Poppins holding the other end of the string. Then came a genuinely unexpected pitch from a Disney executive, who floated the idea of casting a specific, massively famous pop star for the role, someone who had just worked with the studio on a separate short film and was, at the time, about as closely associated with Disney as any celebrity could be. The idea stunned the writers, since the character was meant to be a turn-of-the-century Londoner. Ultimately, the casting complications, along with larger shakeups at the studio, buried the whole project. It stayed shelved for decades until an entirely different creative team eventually made a Poppins sequel in 2018, one where, for better or worse, nobody handed an ice cream cart to a global music superstar. Shortly after the film's release, a music company sued Disney, claiming that the movie's famous nonsense word, "You Know the One," had been lifted from a novelty song written more than a decade earlier. The two versions of the word weren't spelled identically, but they were close enough to land in court. By that point, the film was already playing in hundreds of theaters with thousands more bookings lined up, and Disney had spent a fortune advertising it. A single made-up word was becoming a real legal problem for one of the year's biggest releases. Then Disney's lawyers found the evidence that ended it. A column from a university student newspaper published decades earlier, where a student had already coined her own version of the same nonsense word, years before either the rival song or the film existed. She'd invented it as a joke, a single word that could serve as an all-purpose answer to any question about your opinion on anything, arguably doing the job of an entire sentence. Faced with proof the word had been floating around slang long before anyone involved in the lawsuit claimed to have invented it, the court declined to block the film, and the case quietly disappeared. A word the songwriters always described as pure nonsense turned out to have a documented paper trail, and that paper trail is exactly what got the studio off the hook. P.L. Travers didn't invent Mary Poppins from nothing. Her father died when she was a child, and her family moved in with a formidable, unmarried great-aunt who immediately took charge of the household. Years later, Travers wrote a private essay about that aunt, seemingly realizing only while writing it how much of her famous nanny character had been drawn from real life. Brisk, secretive, quick to shut down sentimentality, and yet somehow able to turn an ordinary chore into an adventure. Then there's the other side of the family. Travers' actual father was a bank employee of Irish descent whose career slid from manager down to clerk as his drinking worsened. Travers adored him and, in her own retellings, transformed him into a far more romantic figure, a dashing plantation owner rather than a struggling clerk. The official record attributes his early death to a seizure disorder, though Travers herself always believed his drinking was the real cause. She even took his first name as her pen name. The nanny who fixes every problem and the father who desperately needed fixing came from opposite branches of the exact same family tree. Nobody got Travers' permission easily. Multiple prominent producers tried to option the book over the years and were turned down flat. The only screen version to appear before Disney's was an obscure, largely forgotten television special from the late 1940s that barely registers as competition. Travers simply didn't trust anyone with the final say over her story. Eventually, financial pressure changed her mind, and in the early 1960s she agreed to a deal, but only with conditions. She insisted on consultation rights, a seat at every story meeting, and a tape recorder running throughout, which is the reason such a detailed behind-the-scenes record of the production even exists today. What she never got was creative control. Across roughly 2 weeks of story conferences, she reportedly objected to nearly everything: the songs, the softened tone given to her nanny, and especially the decision to include an animated sequence. Songwriter Richard Sherman has said the memory of those meetings still unsettles him. After the premiere, Travers reportedly confronted Disney and insisted the animated section be removed entirely. He told her the film was finished and nothing was going to change. She never worked with Disney again and refused for the rest of her life to let the studio adapt any other book in the series. In the early 1960s, Julie Andrews was finishing a long run originating a lead role on Broadway and hoping to reprise a different signature stage role on film, a part she'd played for years. The studio decided she wasn't famous enough for the movie version and cast someone else instead, whose singing voice ended up completely dubbed regardless. Around the same period, Walt Disney saw Andrews on stage and offered her the lead in Mary Poppins, a major live-action musical built around an actress who had never appeared in a single film before. Early the next year, Andrews won a major acting award and used part of her speech to deliver a pointed, gracious-sounding thank you to the studio executive who'd passed her over, a line that's gone down as one of the most quietly savage moments in award show history. The trouble is, that's not where most people remember it happening. It's frequently misattributed to her Oscar speech, but her actual Oscar acceptance a couple of months later thanked only one person by name, Walt Disney, and included a joke about American hospitality, with no mention of the earlier snub at all. The internet's favorite gotcha story about this film is itself the detail people usually get wrong when repeating it. During the ceiling tea party sequence, several cast members were rigged on wires and hoisted into the air for the shot. One child actor playing Michael Banks was afraid of heights and needed real convincing every time the rig lifted him off the ground. So Dick Van Dyke reportedly started paying him a small amount for every take he agreed to float through. A tiny, funny detail tucked inside one of the most purely joyful scenes in the movie. That actor stepped away from acting a few years later and returned to ordinary life. He died young, only in his early 20s, roughly a decade after the film's release. His co-star Karen Detrice has said in later interviews that she regrets losing touch with him after their last project together. Watch the tea party scene again with that in mind, and the joke lands a little differently. A child trying to give away his earnings so the birds outside could eat. We never got the decades most former child stars eventually get to look back on. The actor who spends most of the film floating helplessly to the ceiling, laughing uncontrollably, once earned a major acting nomination for one of the heaviest dramatic performances of his career. Edwin spent decades as a beloved comedic performer known for silly voices and sillier props, famous enough to headline his own long-running radio program, until a failed business venture wiped him out financially, and his style of comedy fell out of fashion, leaving him at a genuine career low by the late 1930s. Years later, his son pushed him to attempt something completely different instead of retiring: serious dramatic acting. Wynn was reportedly terrified and, during rehearsals for a live television drama, kept breaking character and dissolving